Thank you all for coming. So I want to talk to you about the final keyword in PHP, and specifically about the impact it has now PHP is moving to type hinting becoming more and more normal. And what do I mean by that? Imagine a basic class marked as final, and then imagine that's being fed into a method in a class of some type. We've got the type hint right there. And for good measure, we'll also cover what happens if someone makes that consuming class final as well. That's what we're going to cover tonight and look at that. So to get started then, how many of you mark your own code as final? Show of hands. A few people. Some reluctant hands there. So why the reluctance? And why do you do it? What's your motivation? Anybody?
I mark methods as final. Yeah, so if they're in abstract classes, because I don't want someone to do another implementation of it, or override it.
Okay, so you're marking methods, not classes, as final. You don't mark classes as final at all?
If I know they're never going to extend it, I'm right.
Okay. And what about anybody else? Who marks classes as finals and why? Yes, please, at the back.
I'm going to say I'm the author of the class, so I'm responsible for its use and misuse.
You're responsible for its use and misuse. I like that phrase.
Don't want undevelopers extending my class if I can't predict how it's used.
Okay, we're going to come back to that theme later on. Anyone else? Are there any other motives anyone has who's willing to admit it for using final with classes? Nope.
Hope people use composition instead of inheritance. Composition instead of
inheritance. Okay, we'll come back to that one as well. So I want to cover three things in this talk. To make sure we all understand what we're talking about here, we'll look at final and how it affects PHP type hinting. We'll look at a real life example of some real code where final was used and its impact, positive and negative. And we'll see if we can find a halfway house between locking everything down with final and actually still being able to extend and reuse code. Now, some people love final. It's important to acknowledge that. And the things I'm going to discuss tonight, they may not agree that those are problems. And that's perfectly fine, because I'm here to share my experiences. I'm doing this talk because I started running into this problem in a very big way over the summer. It cost me a lot of time. And having worked through how I would handle it, I thought it'd be good to share it with everybody else. But it's important to note there are other opinions out there and they're just as valid as mine. Okay? So I'm not here on a soapbox telling you how things should be done. I'm merely showing you how I would approach a problem and why. That sound good? All right then. So let's get into it and look at final and how it impacts type hinting. So here's a question for everybody. Do you know when the final keyword was added to PHP? Anybody? Yes, please. 5.0. Any bets higher or lower than 5.0? 5.3. 5.3? 4. PHP 4. Okay. Starting to get a bit random there, I think. 5.0 is exactly right. Does anyone know when 5.0 came out? Yes, please. 2004. Absolutely spot on. That's awesome. I had to look that up. It was actually in July. To put that in context, that's 13 years ago. So final has been around for 13 years. Yeah. How many of you remember 5.0 coming out and using it? A few people, quite a few, more than admit using final. Okay. Now what about type hinting? Now PHP 7's brought that to the fore with the way it's extended what can be typed hint to make it practical and the fact you can enforce it now. But do you know when type hinting was introduced to PHP? Anyone's guesses? Yes, please.
It was originally introduced as the classes and arrays in PHP before it was extended later on in PHP 5.7.
PHP 7, you're saying?
No.
Oh?
It was there before, but
Right. Okay. But when, okay, so in that limited form, do you know when it was first added?
think it might have been 5.1, I think it is.
Okay, so 5.1. Bets higher and lower. Who wants to go higher than 5.1?
I'll go for 5.1.
Another 5.1.
5.2.
5.2. 5.3 and 5.0's come out as well. It was 5.0. So it has also been with us for 13 years. Now before we look at what final does with type hinting, let's look at what classical inheritance looks like with type hinting first. And I'm deliberately going to use a very simple example so it fits on the slide and everyone can read it no matter how far back you are. And what we're going to do, we're going to look at the method that's consuming a class and is using a type hint. And then eventually we'll look at the class itself. But diagrammatically, we've got our class and we've got our method and it accepts an input of type bar. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter how it works. We're focused entirely on this particular mechanism. So we can create an object of type bar and that will be accepted as an input. I imagine you do that all the time without thinking about it, okay? Now the thing with class bar, we can also extend it. We can create children of it so that not only can we submit objects of class bar, these children are also acceptable with type hinting, with classical inheritance. Hopefully there's nothing new there for anybody, but that's our starting point. That's what happens before you introduce final. You can do all this stuff all day, every day, all over your code, all over everyone else's code, which maybe is the motivation for using final. We'll find out. But what happens if we start marking things as final? We've got our type hint, but what happens if bar itself is a final class? Anybody? What do you think happens? What do you think you can and can't do? Yes, please.
You can't extend it, you can use the basic class as it is.
Okay, can't extend it. So you can use bar, but you can't use any children of bar. Okay? Does everyone else agree with that? Any other opinions? Anyone seen any other behavior that we haven't discussed? No. Well, you're absolutely right. It's not a trick question. It's not a trick question. Just make sure everybody's got the same understanding. So, final doesn't change where you can use bar itself. That still works. But we are children. We can't use those anymore. Our child classes, our subtypes is the phrase I should be using. And as we've already discussed, it's not a case that it won't accept the children. It's a case that we can't create them. Final shuts down inheritance. You can't extend classes via inheritance if you mark them as final. Now this has an interesting property. And one of the benefits of final classes, if we accept that a class is behavior and state all wrapped into one, final gives us a way to ensure that behavior can be consumed but it can't be modified, which is a desirable behavior. Your point earlier on about responsibility for how other people use and misuse the code you write, that sort of thing. But there's another side effect. We're locking down what we can feed into those classes now when we're using them for type hints. We can only submit that final class, type bar. We can't create any subchildren of it, any subtypes. And that's a problem. This is the central point of my talk. A package maintainer isn't going to know all the different things that bar can become, all the different variants of it. And we'll show you an example later on of that. Which means that if you're locking everything down with final and you're using type hinting, you're limiting how your code can be reused by others, and not always in a positive way. And sometimes we have to work around this. How many of you have had to do that? I mean, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing that talk. I've had to work around this problem over the summer. You have as well, and you as well at the back. So how have you done those workarounds? How have you worked around it?
Copy and paste.
Copy and paste. Now, if you copy and paste, you end up being the maintainer of the code you've copy and pasted, haven't you? Welcome to your code base. Okay, I'm not going to ask you where you work while we're on camera. You're out of shot, so they don't have seen that. Which is a good idea. Yes, please.
I got ranked on by introducing interfaces.
Interfaces instead of code. We're going to come back to that later on.
I
Yes,
used I basically created a class that consumed the
Okay.
class that was final.
Right.
And this, instead of using the final class, I used
Okay.
my own class
Right. Okay.
to
So
encapsulate the,
so you encapsulated it using aggregation.
yeah.
Okay. So let's look at that. What if we did that? What if we extended foo ourselves so that we can override this type hint? I mean, this is a car crash in so many ways, but we're just going to focus on one. First of all, does anyone think that code will run or not? There's a few shaking of heads. Anyone think it will run? Well, it does. But you do get a warning. You do get a warning. But the code actually does run.
Is that in all versions of PHP?
That was tested with PHP7 yesterday, 7.1. I was expecting it to fail, I'll be honest, but it does run. However, we are really pushing the boat out on what OO is supposed to be used for. And while PHP is great at backwards compatibility, it's one of our secret weapons as a community compared to other languages, that's an egregious use of the OO syntax, and it'd be perfectly reasonable for that to be shut down in a future release of PHP. I would have no problem with them breaking backwards compatibility over that. You know, the audience, you guys have been surprised that it worked in the first place. So anyone doing this should know that they're skating on thin ice. I think that's a reasonable thing. But because it works today, some members of our community have a reaction to that, which is final all the things. Yeah. Because we can stop people doing this by making the consuming class final as well. And then you can't extend it via inheritance. It shuts it down completely. And if you try, you get a fatal error, which is perhaps the error you were expecting beforehand. So that's where a lot of code in our community is starting to go. But it brings some problems. I'm going to show those in a moment. Now, final isn't about classes, it's about people. It's about protecting yourself from other people's code and what they do with the code you ship. Your point earlier on, exactly that. If I'm a package maintainer, I ship some code, you extend my class in a way I've not anticipated, and then I accidentally break your code with a future release, even though it passes all my tests. What are you going to do? You're going to go on GitHub and file a bug against my project. And now you're asking me as a package maintainer to maintain your code, even though it's your code that's broken, not mine. And that doesn't mean the person filing the bug is wrong, because they've got code that worked until they did an upgrade. And after the upgrade, it stops working. So there's no right or wrong about this. So package maintainers are using final to protect themselves from that level of work, to protect themselves from how others break their code. But sometimes the packages aren't great, or they're incomplete. And when things go wrong, we get problems, because we can't extend the code to work around them. And I've got a real-life example for you. How many of you saw the drama over the summer with the UUID RFC? There's a few sniggers. How many of you know what the RFC process is for PHP? Is there anyone here not familiar with it? Quite a few people. Okay. So the core PHP maintainers, I am not one of them. I am not a contributor to PHP. I'm just someone who talks about it. The core contributors, what they've done is they've organized this wiki where you can go and post information about an upcoming change you want to introduce to PHP, and people will go and debate it, vote on it. PHP internals gets fun, shall we say, and we'll leave it at that. And eventually a decision's made one way or the other. But you can read all the proposals for upcoming changes on the wiki. It's all open for everyone to see. And over the summer, one of these was to add UUID functionality into core PHP. Now at the heart of this, and the reason for this talk, in fact, was the fact it was based around a final class called UUID. Now, how many of you know what UUIDs are? How many of you have worked with them? Another show of hands. Most people. For those of you who haven't, they're a form of ID, but the differences between those and, say, auto-incrementing keys on a MySQL table is all of our laptops in here could be generating IDs right now without talking to each other, and statistically, the collisions are so low, you're almost guaranteed to be unique. There's certainly not enough people in this room for collisions to happen. And we could run that as fast as your laptops will go for the entire night, and there shouldn't be any collisions because of the math behind it. That's what UUIDs are. Now, because this can happen without computers talking to each other, they're a standard solution for sorting out systems that need to scale and systems that are distributed, where data is created in one system and then needs to flow through to other systems via APIs, which makes them useful as primary keys in databases, which is my interest in them. Now, the thing with primary keys, normally most people, especially PHP developers, are using integers, auto-incrementing integers in something like MySQL tables. Yeah, MySQL IDs. And they're normally integers. But you can use a UUID in the same place, and we can type hint them. Now, the first use case I want to deal with, because otherwise it will come up in the comments afterwards on when the talk's posted, is what do we want to do if we want to abstract away our ID? We want to hide what type of ID we're using. We want to take that ID and hide it, so people don't need to know whether it's an integer, UUID, a postcode, or whatever anyone's using as a primary key. See, we can't do this because UUID is final. We can't extend it via inheritance. So we can't do that, we can't hide it. So how would you solve that? Yes, please.
Make all the methods final.
Make all the methods final. Okay. Let's assume we can't change the UUID class for the moment. How would you work with that to create an ID that hides the underlying thing?
You could have the myID method called getID, which just wraps around and calls UUID behind the scenes.
All right. Can anyone go any further than that? We've talked about wrapping it. Yes, please.
You can do a facet class, which would then extract a different person ID.
Okay, a facade.
Okay. Reflection.
Reflection. Please don't. I did. Well, I would use the decorator pattern. Decorator, facade. For me, it's the decorator. Don't ask me the differences until I've had a beer. Are any of you familiar with the decorator pattern? The hand there at the back. So you'll be able to tell me whether I've got this right or wrong then, which will be awesome. So the idea is, we can't do this, so we create a new class. Doesn't extend from anything. Internally, it has the real ID mechanism, and it provides public methods that internally call through to the underlying ID. Now, the reason I went for a decorator rather than a facade is, and I could be wrong on this, but for me, the ID's interface, its public methods, are under our control and may not necessarily map one-to-one to the methods of whatever we're wrapping and hiding. And for me, that feels like a decorator. But I'm open for debate on that, provided there's a pint first. Okay? So that's how to deal with hiding things. It's not much to do with final other than a way to work around it. But I mentioned earlier about UUIDs and primary keys, and that's my interest in them. Now the thing is, I don't know if any of you actually use UUIDs as primary keys, but if you do, hopefully you know that they perform badly. They are terrible at this. Doesn't matter what you do with your indexes, because they're distributed over such a random, I'm trying to think of the word now. Because there's a lot of scope for them. They're not ordered in any way, shape or form, which means database index engines have to do a lot of lookups to find them. They don't sort nicely into B trees, etc. But someone's got a solution for that called comb GUIDs or combs. Anyone heard of those? Nope. Oh, one person has. Okay. I use these in something I maintain at the minute commercially. Now, they've been around even longer than Final has in PHP. Jimmy Nelson came across this and wrote up a description of this and the problem and the solution back in 2002. 15 plus years ago. And the basic solution is, if we take our UUID, Each of these X's would be a normal single hexadecimal digit of some kind. With MySQL, it turns out the front end of it needs to be ordered for indexes to work well. But SQL Server needs the back end of it to be ordered for it to work well. Don't ask me why. That's an odd place for indexes to be sorted on, but that's what you've got to do. So that means you don't have one comb GUID. You have to make a comb GUID scheme for each database engine you want to support in order to get the right performance, which makes it fun if you want to migrate data from one, from MySQL to an SQL Server back system and back again. Now, I mentioned the decorator pattern earlier. What do you think about that for implementing comb GUIDs? Would that be a way that feels reasonable? No, yes, no, not sure. Not sure. A couple of shakings of heads. That's your neck, fair enough. It isn't, I would argue, because when we're hiding what type of ID scheme we're using, we're abstracting it away, and the decorator pattern's there for abstraction. But what we're doing here is we're creating another form of ID, and that's a variant. Now, it's not a surprise that the PHP RFC didn't include support for comb GUIDs out the box, that they didn't have these schemes available and implemented and part of the RFC to submit to core. We've seen here, most people here haven't worked with them at all, haven't come across them, and don't even use UUIDs as primary keys. It's quite an esoteric field. So that's fair enough. Yeah, we're not going to expect that or that to be part of core. But because it's final, because they made the UUID class final, that's a problem. It's not a problem that they didn't include it, it's a problem that they stopped anyone else from creating their own solution in userland. They locked it down too much, even when they didn't know all the possible variants. Maybe they thought they did, I don't know. I haven't reached out to them, I haven't talked to them, I don't know what was going through their head. But the reality is they locked it down too much and made it impossible with the RFC implementation to create comb GUIDs using core code. Fortunately, it didn't get into core in its current form. I don't know if it's going to come back again or not, but it did get voted down, which I'm very relieved about. Once stuff's in core, fixing it takes many, many years when we ship broken interfaces. So it's good that we're cautious about what we include in PHP. So, here's a question for any of you, especially those of you who use final. Are there circumstances where it's reasonable to lock it down that much, do you think? Can anyone come up with a good reason why? Because I couldn't. Admittedly, I'm the one sat there tearing my hair out going, I've got to work around this, rather than actually ship the code I'm supposed to be writing. So I came at it from a bad place. But maybe you've seen a positive reason why. Yes?
One I can think of is enums.
Enums. Okay. But even enums get extended over time.
Yes, but if they're used for something different, then you generally want to have, even if it's repeated, because one may change but the other may not.
Okay.
Especially if you use them for database values which are already persisted.
Okay. Using them for database values that are already persisted. That's an interesting one. I'd have to go away and digest that. But how would you implement your enums? Would they be in one class, a class per enum value? How would you do that?
Use the, I can't remember what the vendor name is, but there's an extension.
Okay.
Or
there's an extension. All right, fair enough. Okay. So that's one possible use case, and I've not thought of that. Yes, please, at the back.
Just thinking of types.
Types?
Specifically really simple types.
Okay. Types for value objects. But a UUID is a value object, and we've just shown that there are reasons to extend it that the people who created the implementation didn't know about. The original authors of the UUID types, the 5 main types, I imagine none of them knew about the performance problems with databases at the time. I'd be surprised if they did. So that's my immediate response, I'm afraid, to that one. I would argue anything that looks simple today may not be simple once it's in someone else's hands and they're using it to solve their problems. So even if it looks simple to us, solving our problems, when someone's solving their own problems, I think it's actually a barrier. I can't come up with anything myself, anything reasonable. Yes, please.
I never used final if I'm writing bootstrap code I don't want to mess around with.
Bootstrap code you don't want people to mess about with. That's an interesting one. I like that idea. I think that would be worth exploring further. And yes, please.
Something like value object, but that has an equals method on it, so you don't want someone to extend it because they might forget to alter the equals method.
Okay.
It's more protection against people doing something wrong.
Okay, so you don't want them to extend it, but we're not just talking about extending here, we're talking about also it being able to use it as a value that we can inject into other systems. You're not just stopping people, you're forcing people to only use what you've thought of. And what if someone's thought of something else that's needed, like the comb grids, for example? How are they supposed to solve that? Do what I did. Shout loudly on Twitter. Yes, please.
I've seen an example of a class that had value members inside it that were not accessible outside.
Right.
But there was, they were marked as final.
Okay.
And on one of them,
Right.
there was an actual security bug.
Okay.
Because it had a bit to do with crypto and randomness and things like that.
Okay.
And as it was marked final inside the class,
Right.
even if it was not exposed externally, ever,
Okay.
it needed to be replaced.
Right.
And as it was final,
Couldn't be replaced.
well, it was in Java, so everything in Java can be replaced.
Fair enough.
But it was complicated.
Okay.
Like,
So that sounds like it just caused problems, it didn't actually solve any.
no,
Right.
just
Okay.
caused problems for the maintenance of better crypto.
Okay. Right. So I think as a group, we're really struggling to come up with general cases. We've mentioned protecting bootstrap code. We've mentioned a possible general case to do with enums. We've mentioned a possible case because of the complexity of creating a reasonable subclass. But really we're struggling as a group to say this is good behavior all the time. It seems easier to come up with problems than justifications to me. Would you say that was fair? Yep. A few noddings of heads, a few not so sures. But I want to show you a different way. I want to show you how you can do this and still keep final and not have these problems. And I want to use the solid principles for this. How many of you know what the solid principles are? Most people, but not everybody. Okay. So we'll do a very quick recap of those then. They're design principles. They're about guiding you with the design of your classes and your overall system. A lot of people focus on them as just class design principles, but they're actually system design principles that can be applied to classes. It's not quite the same thing, and I'll show you what we mean with that later on. There's 5 principles: single responsibility, open closed, Barbara-Liskov substitutions, interface segregation, and dependency inversion, which is obviously the PHP community went absolutely nuts for this with DI containers through the roof. I'm not going to focus on explaining all these 5 in detail. People have been doing talks in our community, have been doing talks on Solid for many years. Go online, go on YouTube, go onto other user groups' websites, look at their past talks, and you'll see in-depth talks about all of these. What I'm more interested is how they intersect with final and how they impact that. So can anyone guess which of these are impacted by marking things as final? We're looking for 2 of them. Open closed, okay. And Liskov, okay. Any other votes? Does anyone think final impacts single responsibility? No, no takers. Can't sell you that one. What about interface segregation? Nope. What about dependency inversion? Anyone think final, or has anyone seen final impacting that? No, well, I haven't either. Absolutely right. Open closed and Liskov substitutions. Now, open closed is generally described as open for extension, and closed for modification. That's how it's described. If you go on the Wikipedia page, like I did when I was writing these slides, you'll see that exact phrase on there. Notice it doesn't say classes are open and closed. It just says open and closed. This is about a system that's implemented with designs written in classes. Now, we've already shown that final makes sure a class is closed for modification. We can't extend a final class. We've already seen that. We've already covered that one. But the thing is, final also ensures that the consuming class is closed for extension. It's not just closed for modification, it's closed for extension, because we can't create these subtypes and send them into our method. We can't do that. So we've actually closed that down. That's a problem using the solid model. And if we look at Barbara Liskop's substitution principle, that's the text. What it basically means is when you create subtypes, don't just follow the letter of the public API, follow the spirit of it as well. So that if we take any of these subtypes and use them, we are not breaking the program as a whole. We're not breaking the expectations, the assumptions that are made about class bar. That's the general idea of it. Follow the spirit of it, not just the letter of it. So you could say it's subclassing with caveats. But the thing is, we can't do that. We've shown final stops us creating subtypes. If we mark our value as final, we can't do that. So we can't create substitutions, good or bad or indifferent, to use. So we're shutting down the substitution principle as well. So what do you think? Are the two completely incompatible? Anyone think of a way forward?
So in your method, use an interface. So like if you expect bar, it should be bar interface or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then your implementations can be final.
So use interfaces. Right. Now, what does anyone else think? Someone earlier mentioned interfaces. I forget who, I apologise. Yeah. And that's it. We can take the interface segregation principle and we can apply that to our code. People focus on classes should implement interfaces. They should be concrete implementations of abstractions, and the interfaces are your concepts, is the idea. And no one ever talks about it with type hinting. But what if your type hints were interfaces rather than classes, which is what you were saying? So our value object, it needs to implement an interface. I couldn't call it bar interface, I'm sorry. I hate this trend of calling thing interface. I hate, loathe and detest it. So I'm sorry, I couldn't do it. And interface 1 was the best I could come up with. Yep. But now our method, instead of accepting type bar, accepts type interface 1 instead. Anything that implements that interface can now go into our method. So here's our diagram from earlier, but now it's accepting an interface. Our value object, if it doesn't implement an interface, now gets rejected. It has to implement the interface in order to be accepted. So we've now made a change there. We still can't create subtypes of our class, our value object. We can't do it. It's still not allowed. Final's still there, which means that the class is still closed for modification, which is one of the things we want for the open close principle. And one of the reasons people use final. We're not stopping them doing that. But by using the interface in class foo, foo can now accept new variants. They're just not child classes anymore. They're just other implementations of the same interface. That's the difference. And we can submit those up, and they'll all be accepted now. We can all do that. So that gives us closed for modification, but open for extension by using interfaces. And what about subtypes? We still want to be able to use the substitution principle. It's really powerful for making sure third parties can extend your code without breaking a system as a whole. And on large teams, on large projects with lots of teams, this is a very important thing that comes up lots and lots of times in code reviews, even if you don't name it, when one team is reusing code written by another team. Now we can't extend the class. We can't do it. And we're not removing the final keyword. But what we can do is extend the interface. We can take our interface and we can create subtypes of the interface rather than the class itself. Subtypes don't just have to be classes. They can be interfaces because we can use interfaces in type hinting. So instead of this, which we can't do, we now get this, where we're extending the interface with subtypes. And we're using the interface 1, because I can't think of anything better, in our type hints and our methods. So now Liskov's substitution principle still applies. We can now do that. Does everyone see where I'm going with that? Does everyone agree with that? Does anyone do anything like this in your own code? You do? A couple of people? But not many. So those of you who don't, what do you think? Have you ever thought about, you see the opportunities available by actually being able to extend an interface as well if necessary? I mean, you'll extend interfaces a lot less than you will classes, but you've now got the opportunity to do so, and you're not breaking anything else in the process because everything else is still locked down as final. It's really powerful. Go away, have a play with it, and let me know how you get on with it. If you hate it, tell the organisers so they don't invite me back, and if you like it, leave a comment on joined in so everyone can see that but it helped. Now, our folks who love to final all the things, our final class foo. I have a response to them. Stick an interface on it. Interface anything you mark as final. Our final class, which is our consuming class now, should still implement an interface. Because this might be used as a value somewhere else. Who can say? Especially if you've got other people reusing your code. And this gives you this nice behavior. You've still locking things down for modification, but the system is open. By using interfaces, the system's open, and it's open via variants. It gives you that power. It gives people who use your code the ability to extend it in ways you have not anticipated without causing you any grief, which is the holy grail we all want, I hope. Certainly as someone who uses other people's code, I love this. And I'll show you what I mean with the UUID RFC, just to finish up. So we had our final class, and this was the problem. Because I wanted to use it as a type hint, but it was too locked down. I couldn't create my comb GUIDs. But if we apply our principle of interface all the final things, here's what we can get instead. Now I think a UUID is an interface. It's a concept. There are multiple types of UUIDs, multiple variants, some of which are in the official standards and some, like comb GUIDs, have risen out of a practical need to address performance issues. So I think a UUID, in this particular instance, works better as an interface rather than as a class that implements an interface. We still can't do this. When we want to create our variants for MySQL and SQL Server, we still can't extend UUID. Originally because it was final, now because it's an interface. Classes can't extend interfaces. But we can implement that interface. So everywhere that wants a UUID will now accept one of the variants. And that means our userland UUIDs are now fully supported. I can have all my comb GUIDs really easily, and it doesn't break any of the core code at all. Now, what about our abstraction from earlier? Again, we can't extend. We still have to go back to our decorator pattern and use aggregation for this, because we're creating an abstraction. We're not creating a type of ID. We're creating something to hide the type of ID. It's a different thing. So we should still be using aggregations and the decorator pattern for that. Now, our abstractions would benefit from interfaces as well, but that's a different talk. So if you're giving the feedback, maybe I'll get invited back in a couple of years' time to give a talk like that, but that's not for today, okay? So to sum up, if you want to hide something, use something like the decorator pattern. Use an abstraction. Final classes, you can consume their behavior, but you can't modify them. That's what it does. But it also locks them down when you use them for type hinting. And it creates problems for people who are reusing your code. Because package maintainers, and we've shown a concrete example here, an example that nearly got 50% of the votes to go into core. I don't know what the threshold is. I don't know if it's 50% or 2/3 for that type of change. You'd have to look that up, unless someone here knows. 50%. So this failed by like 2 votes to get into core. Yep, and we'd have had problems on our hands for goodness knows how many years. It almost got in. Because it's not reasonable to expect package maintainers to know the problem domain 100%. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Use interfaces and inheritance with interfaces to create new variants. Final classes that don't implement interfaces, they're preventing reuse. They're restricting it, which is the desire, as we mentioned at the very start. But I think it's a little unreasonable. And one of the reasons for that is because they're not solid. They break the solid principles. And while solid might look like a bit like a gimmick, for those of you who haven't used it, I've yet to see anyone break it as a set of principles and prove that when done in the spirit of what it means rather than as a rote thing, I've yet to see anyone prove that solid's a bad idea. Anyone's got some proof of that? Buy me a pint and we'll talk about it, because I can learn something. But I think these final classes that don't use interfaces, they're a code smell. That's how I treat them in my code reviews. And I strongly recommend you think about doing the same in your own code, if I've managed to convince you tonight. Hopefully I've shown you and convinced you that final classes should never ever be used as type hints. Please use interfaces. Please interface all the final things. Please do that. You'll make me very happy if I use your package. In fact, if I find someone doing this, I will shout out about it on Twitter. That's how happy you'll make me. I will not be so grumpy for a change. And if we do all this, we get this situation here where behavior is closed for modification, but the system is still open for extension. We can still introduce new variants if we follow this approach. What do you think? Have I convinced anybody? There's a few nodding heads. Has anyone fallen asleep? No one's going to admit that, at least. Are there anyone got any counter-arguments to any of this? Anyone think that it's a lot of trouble for no gain, for example, which is normally the reason why people don't take an extra step when writing code? Especially those of you who are used to some of the PHP projects that aren't as heavily OO, perhaps, where OO is something that's almost bolted onto the design of the application rather than baked in. Anyone see any problems with it? Any reason not to do it? No? Stunned silence.
What about iterable and array?
Iterable and array.
So, arguably, you could say array is a concrete implementation, couldn't you? Whereas iterable is its interface. But then you're losing some of the extra bits, aren't you? So, like, if you would then want to use it for all your array functions.
Okay, so an array isn't an object. So you can't use final with it to the best of my knowledge. If you can use final with it, I'm not aware of that. You can use array object, but obviously an array object you can't pass into PHP's array functions directly. And you also lose some performance benefits by using PHP core arrays. So I'm not sure it applies in that situation, because I don't think you can mark arrays as final.
But a lot of people are only having the iterable element. If the only thing you do inside is a for each, you should probably use iterable rather than array in that. It's kind of...
Well, how does it get to the for each loop? That would be the question I would ask. Ultimately, there's a good chance it's been passed in as a parameter from somewhere else. And then I think we're back to the arguments I've presented in my talk tonight about using interfaces as type hints in order to get that iterable object to that point. And if the object's implementing iterable, it's already implementing an interface. And therefore, I mean, you don't have to implement iterable to use it in a for each loop. I don't know if you know that. You can do for each over any object with public properties, and it will work. I do that a lot with standard class, for example. That's my go-to data bag, if you like. But if it explicitly implements iterable, It's already being used, it's already got an interface you can use as a type hint if you want to. Okay? How does that sound? All right. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Would you say that's more important to people creating packages that people are going to be using, rather than whereas if it's your own code and you've decided that something should never be extended because there's only that exact one case for that exact type of class?
So packages versus own code that you maintain yourself. My normal argument against that is code tends to outlive contributors. Most code tends to change hands if it's used in anger over the years. I've got code that's live. Any of you using Linux systems, my code's on there. Code I wrote back in '94. And I haven't touched it since '94. And believe me, if you found that code, you'd see why. But that code's been around now for 23 years, coming on for, yeah, over 23 years now. That code's been live and out on the internet. And any of you who have Linux systems, that code's on your system, 100% guaranteed. It's nothing special. It's just like a cockroach. No one's managed to kill it yet. Okay? But I haven't touched that code for over 20 years. It's still out there. Other people have maintained it. I wouldn't be surprised to find I'm no longer even listed as a maintainer of it because it's been through so many hands since I last touched it. And I don't have a problem with that at all. I don't think that's unreasonable. But code tends to outlive developers, especially on commercial projects where you do have multiple people. Code can live 5 to 10 years, but the average tenure of a developer in a job is less than 4 years. Most people move on in less than 4 years from one job to the next. The code outlives the developers. So I would argue this is good practice if you're using code that anyone else is likely to inherit in the future from you. I also argue that good engineering is a habit. And if you practice good engineering all the time and do it as your default behavior, you can write code that sticks first time and has less bugs and needs less rework and fixing. That's one of the things I teach people when I'm doing mentoring, is if you write first time is a habit to get into, and it reduces the amount of rework. Rework is where a lot of projects slip and lose time. Does that answer your question? Is it a convincing answer? Not really. Okay, fair enough. Anyone else, please? Yes, please.
I'm not going to argue for final, and I'm not going to argue against interfaces, but can you just make an argument that all OO extension is inherently dangerous and should only be done at the user's risk?
OO extension is dangerous and should only be done at the user's risk. I don't know. See, the thing for me is OO is just a way of organizing code. Ultimately, when you get onto the CPU, all code runs the same. And so OO, functional, it's as much an abstraction about how we present code, how we think about code, rather than how it runs. So where am I going with that? That's a very good question. I think if code's there to be extended, that's what OO is all about. Inheritance, if you take inheritance out of OO, you're left with types, but you're also left with a lot of copy and paste. That's what you end up with, because you can't extend and reuse so easily. Aggregation doesn't scale on its own. You can't aggregate all the things, because honestly, the sun will burn out first. It just takes too long to aggregate all the things. It's an unbalanced approach. You need a balance, a mixture of aggregation and a mixture of inheritance. That's a more pragmatic approach. And we're also in a world where most people don't necessarily understand the inner workings of what they're extending. So I think we need to make it as safe as possible for them without just putting a hand up and going, go away. For me, one of my concerns with the community that's pushing final all the things as the default behavior is they are saying to everyone else, they're making them feel like, you're an idiot, we can't trust you, go away. It's like it or lump it. That's how, now that may not be their intention, but that's how it can come across to people. And also, we've got all these packages on Packagist. If it's hard to reuse them, and people are being forced to create their own implementations, as a community, I think we're lessened by it. those of us who are old enough to have programmed Perl remember CPAN and the heady days of that. And just being able to pull packages down and reuse them so easily made Perl such an efficient language to write in once. Perl is a write once language, always has been. I fear it will never change. But it can be done, I think. And you look at the Node community and how they're doing with reusing packages. And it's allowing them to get more things done in less time because they're spending less time reinventing wheels, unless it's packaging up front-end build chains, where there's a new package manager every week. But reuse empowers people to get things done. And at the end of the day, how many of us are paid to write low-level packages? And how many of us are paid to ship working code for the business of organization that pays our bills? I'm paid to ship working code. The people I ship to don't see most of this functionality. If it's in a package, it's too low level for them to see and care about. That's not the interface they care about. They care about the interface that's being presented out. That's taking money off punters. That's converting people into sales. Because it's a business at the end of the day, and things have to pay for our toys.
I don't think it's a good assumption, because there is a security risk. Because if you are just pushing, pulling the packages left and right,
Yeah.
you are introducing basically liability for whoever's actually playing your wheels. So
Yes, there is.
there's a balance that needs to be struck.
There is a balance that needs to be struck. We're not there yet with that balance. Most organizations are pulling in packages and they're not even checking the license terms. They're not checking GPL, free software versus open source. Now that is another talk someone needs to do, picking a license and the differences between free software and open source. Someone needs to do that. Please, someone else do it. Definitely needs to be done. But that balance isn't there. People are consuming packages blindly. That is the behavior. And I think we have to accept that that's human nature. And I think we have to try and work with it as much as possible rather than hold up barriers, to be honest. I just don't see the world changing. It's just gone that way. I mean, 20 odd years ago, when I was a Perl programmer, we did vet everything we pulled in. We knew who wrote the packages. Chances are we had an email conversation with them at some point, either when we pulled the package down or when we tried to use them, we reached out to them for help. We built those relationships. But the communities and our industry was tiny then compared to now. There's so many of us writing code and using code and consuming code. Is those personal relationships, they don't scale, they're not possible at scale anymore. And I think that shifted the debate. And it does create those liabilities like with security, but I can't see a way around that today. Do you have one? What do you recommend?
What do I recommend?
Yeah.
So your answer was quite long.
Yes. This is why people should buy me a pint instead. It was about the fact that there was a concern about the security risk of using third-party code. But because of the scale of the industry now and the amount of code we reuse...
I'm concerned about the Rove security package.
That's very true.
Should be using.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Which at least will blacklist packages with known security problems, which is a good start. Okay, I think we need to wrap it up there.
Final question about final.
You've been waiting to say that, haven't you? All right. Thank you all very much.